Kia ora, tena koutou, everyone. Welcome to this third Faculty Development Journal Club session. Could you please move the slide forward? Today, we're going to discuss informal faculty development in health professions education. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge Maori as Tangata Whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners, custodians, and knowledge holders of the lands and waters in Australia on which we live and work, and to their elders past, present, and future. I would like to invite you to add your acknowledgement in the chat so that we introduce ourselves to one another. Kia ora, tena koutou. Ko Megan Anakin, Toko Ingoa. My name is Megan Anakin, and I'm an Associate Fellow of AMEE and a member of the Faculty Development Committee. And I will be your host for this journal session. I'm a Senior Lecturer and Education Advisor at the Dunedin School of Medicine at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. I'm also the Secretary of the Australian and New Zealand Association for Health Professional Educators, ANZAPE, here in Australasia. And just to let you know, my research interests are about conceptual and skill development of students and teachers in simulation, interprofessional, and faculty development contexts. And this little mihi is important because we are going to be very located in our practice today. So I'd like you to think about a brief introduction that you will make of yourself when we move to breakout rooms in just a little while. Svetlana Koshila and their colleagues have provided us with a succinct article about the everyday educational practices they identified as opportunities for informal faculty development amongst health professional educators in academic settings. They provide us with 3 everyday educational practices to consider as support for their informal faculty development. They also extend their analysis of qualitative interview data with 10 academic health professional educators at their institution to identify factors that influence those educators to engage in formal faculty development opportunities. So to prepare the reader for this journey, Svetlana Koshila and their colleagues introduce us to their perspective informing their study. They view faculty development as a social enterprise that occurs through community participation and is supported by social and peer networks, and they ground it in real-world experiences. They define educational practices as habitual, ongoing activities related to teaching and learning that develop opportunities to learn and develop educational expertise. They used situated cognition theory, I'd like to use another one that sounds similar, to inform the design of their study so that they were sensitized to the learning opportunities that occur through their work and participation in authentic practices and environments. The interplay between the individual and their environment create conditions for learning that they refer to as affordances and constraints using this theory. I found it really interesting. I learned a new term called affectivities, and I found that might be new to you as a reader. It's used to recognize how an individual's unique skills and capabilities can shape how they engage with conditions for learning. The authors make effective use of the theoretical framework to inform their study design and introduce key concepts and terms that they use to analyze and interpret the data that they generate with the 10 academic health professional educators that they interviewed. And they identified 3 everyday educational practices that provide opportunities or affordances for informal faculty development in the academic setting. I've listed them on the slide, but I know they're going to discuss them in a bit more detail, so I'm not going to steal their thunder. What I would like to do, though, is I want them to orient you to the affordances and constraints. Like the authors of this article, those of us who are participating in today's journal club have varied professional backgrounds and experience with education. So it's going to be very important for all of us to take a moment to reflect on our experience with faculty development, whether it's formal or informal, whether it's as a participant or a facilitator, and educational research in general. I think that will be very important, contextualizing. I will invite you to notice the diverse perspectives that we bring to the conversation that will be facilitated by Svetlana and Koshila today. So with this very brief summary and review completed, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce our two guest authors and Journal Club facilitators today. First is Svetlana King, who is a senior lecturer in health professions education and a learning coach coordinator and portfolio advisor for the research and scholarship theme in the Flinders MD program. In her roles, she's involved in education research, research supervision, and developing coaching skills and expertise among her faculty. She has a background in secondary education. And Koshila is a senior lecturer and the course coordinator of the clinical education postgraduate courses at the College of Medicine and Public Health. She's also co-chair of the College of Medicine and Public Health Learning and Teaching Academy in Flinders, Adelaide, Australia. Koshila, like myself, is also a member of ANZAPI. She's our vice president, so we're very privileged to have her now. She's passionate about supporting the development of educational and scholarly capacity among her students, academic colleagues, and broader professional community. And I think the strengths of these two facilitators shine through in their paper, and you're going to see it in action as I hand over to them. Over to you, please, Koshila and Svetlana.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you very much. So what Koshila and I thought we might do in terms of our reflections is to sort of talk about the processes that underpinned the development of this particular paper. And so the research was supported by a relatively new grant initiative in the Flinders College of Medicine and Public Health, and was really designed to support educators to build their knowledge, skills, and expertise in teaching and learning. And so when we initially developed our proposal, we needed to be really mindful of the needs of not only the institution, but also our own individual needs as researchers and scholars in health professions education. And so to address both the individual and the institutional needs, we really structured our research project as both a needs analysis, so essentially an evaluation of what's currently working well and where there are perhaps some gaps that we need to address in the support that we provide to educators. And we also adopted a scholarly approach to faculty development in this project. So our college really wanted to know what our education staff needed in terms of their professional development. And then as individuals with that scholarly mindset, our approach was really firmly rooted in asking questions that would have relevance to audiences beyond the immediate context. So to people like you who are reading or who have read this paper. And we often discuss this with our Master of Clinical Education students, that it's really about finding a balance between the individual and the organisational needs and crafting a project that fulfills both requirements or both sets of objectives. And at the end of the project, we were able to produce a report for our college, which really addressed those evaluation needs. And the other product was the scholarly project, which is the publication that we're discussing today. And I've applied a similar approach to another project that I'm working on, where we merged two planned projects into one research and evaluation project. And we've similarly been able to develop two separate outputs from that project. So a report for the college and also a research output related to our research topic. And that project really had a nice it evolved organically, I guess, in terms of the merging of those two projects, because both project teams were interested in collecting data from the same sets of people. So it really made sense from an efficiency perspective to combine those two projects. And so I guess the key take-home message for me is that if and when you're designing a project, it's really important to understand whose needs must be met, to clarify the objectives of the key stakeholders, and strategically use that information to inform the development of a proposal that's responsive to those needs. And that may require discussions with various people in the planning stages, and paying really careful attention to the type of data that you're collecting, or the questions that you're asking of your participants. And that can really be helpful to look at it from a quality improvement perspective, but also looking at asking questions and answering questions that extend beyond that immediate organisational context. So there's sort of some of my thoughts on the process of developing our paper. And now I'll hand over to Kashila.
Thank you, Svetlana and Megan. So welcome, everyone. I won't say good morning because I know it's afternoon in New Zealand. So I guess my reflection is also about the process. So we're really keen to give you an insight, not into the artifact, which is the publication, but to the behind the scenes of what goes on when you bring together a team of people. As you can see, our colleagues, we had a number of colleagues joining us in this project, and we're all very different. So we've come from, some of us from an education background, some from a nursing background, others had a paramedicine background, others have had a public health background, and also one of our colleagues is from an allied health speech pathology background. So here we are, a diverse team of people. We were located across this broad geographic footprint, through from Adelaide up to the Northern Territory in Australia. So this is this huge geographic footprint. We've come from different disciplines, and we also had different levels of expertise in doing health professions education research. Some of us have PhDs in medical education or education. Other people have masters, other people are on their PhD journey. So we really came with a mixed bag of skills. So in that process, we really had to engage as a team. And the key principle, I think, that really represents what we did in this project was reflexivity. So reflexivity, it took three different, it looked different in three ways. So there's reflexivity on our own stance and perspective as individuals. You know, what are the ways in which we thought about faculty development and the ways in which it happened. So we thought about that as individuals, and we also had many discussions about our stance and perspective and values around faculty development as a team. So here we were a few individuals getting together, and we really had to have lots of conversations and reflect on our position as a team and what we thought about faculty development. And so that reflexivity on our kind of paradigm, the way of seeing the world, and on our values, which is that axiology principle, really informed the choice of our theory. So we picked situativity theory for a certain reason, because it aligned with our worldview, it aligned with our values around faculty development. The second element of reflexivity was a more of a reflecting on the context of faculty development. So once again, because we were a broad group in very different settings, we were able to really think about how does faculty development happen in our own context, in our own setting. It looks so different. And so again, we were very reflexive on the idea of context and the idea that the practices of individuals, the practices of individual researchers, educators, educational scholars are shaped by and also kind of contribute to shaping the social world around them. So we're very engaged in looking at our context. And then the final reflection or reflexivity point for us was around the wider discipline of health professions education. So we really began to notice, as we engaged in the literature, as you do for a project like this, about how faculty development was positioned and perceived in the literature, and so there we know, and we acknowledge in our paper, there's a big focus on the formal mechanisms for faculty development. But once again, because we understood that faculty development often happens through these connections one has when one is immersed in practice, when one is immersed in collaboration, we really were thinking about how do we position and start a different conversation about faculty development. So those were the 3 points of reflexivity, I think, that you can't quite see in the paper, but that really supported the background process that we engaged in. So that's so at this point, I think we would like to open this up for some further conversation. We're going to summarize our theoretical framework and the ideas of affordances, effectivities, and constraints in the later slides. But I think it's a point at time where we can stop talking and maybe ask you for some questions or reflections or some commentary around our paper or anything we've said so far. So I'll hand over to Megan actually, and if she can lead this part of the session, and we'll try and respond.
Certainly. Could you move the slide forward, please, Cashella?
Thank you.
I'd like to invite you to either place your question in the chat if you'd prefer that method, or please use one of the reactions, or just raise your hand and turn on your camera. You're also welcome to open your microphone.
And as Megan said before, this is about us taking an opportunity to reflect on the things that we do as educators, as educational scholars, as researchers. So, even if it's a front of mind reflection about how you do faculty development, how you engage in upskilling your expertise, we'd love to hear from you.
And also perhaps, oh, sorry, I was just going to say also perhaps if anyone is considering doing a scholarly project around the faculty development work that they're already doing, we'd love to hear your sort of perspective and your approach to developing that proposal and the things that you're considering as you're designing that project.
Thank you. And just to make one more comment while we're waiting for people to think if they have a question. Perhaps we don't have questions out there yet, but the reflexivity paragraph in your article was very brief, and one of my questions I think you've answered right now, because I think a lot of us have a hard time understanding how much to put in there, and you've explained your experience with faculty development and education research really well. I think it comes through in how you composed the article very succinctly. And I know often when we're writing for a medical teacher, for example, it's 3,000 words. And your statement about reflexivity can only be short, but I notice you've woven that thoughtfulness in your word choice throughout the article, which is a very elegant way of revealing that for the reader. We have a question from Annette, please. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm Annette from the University of Sydney. Hi, Cashella, nice to see you. I have a question, and I apologise up front for not having read your journal article thoroughly, but turning up at the journal club without having done that, I'm sorry. I have a question about how do you think you engage clinicians in perhaps encouraging them to keep a portfolio on their development of education, education faculty development activities that they've completed, and how important it might be for them to show that? Do you have thoughts about that?
Thank you, Annette. That's a great question. I guess what the paper and this project has reminded us about is that there are faculty development moments embedded into our everyday practice, I guess. And so even before we get to the point of composing those portfolios, I think it's conversations like this that remind us there are those teachable moments. So if we think about ourselves as faculty, there are those learnable moments in project conversations we have, in meetings that we're part of. So I think with clinicians, who are probably in a very, very different environment where there's no opportunity or very little opportunity for reflection and reflexivity. It's about engaging them in the conversations about how you bring the world of everyday work and development and learning closer together, which is what this project was about. It was in fact saying the projects that we do, the work that we do, the interactions we have with each other. So this idea of a social practice came through loud and clear. So here we are. This is also a faculty development event, and so just bringing those two worlds closer together is something I think we need to be having more conversations about. And then I think, as you absolutely have pointed out, it helps us to start to be more deliberate in the way that we engage in those. So we go primed with questions that we might have about things relating to us. We go primed to take away things and kind of think about how we might put them into practice. So I think it's about developing our practice and our skill set to really be more deliberate in the way we engage in these interactions, which seem ad hoc, opportunistic, but in fact, they're really powerful places for learning. Svetlana, anything from you?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was writing some notes because it's kind of the portfolio side of things is definitely one of my kind of pet projects in my role as the learning coach coordinator of the Doctor of Medicine program at Flinders. And I think it's really about establishing a culture of openness and having this shared sense that everyone is kind of developing along the way, that some people are sort of further along in that process than others, and that it's really a chance for us all to be working together to learn from each other's expertise. And I think, certainly being opportunistic with those situations where we can get clinicians to be thinking about their teaching at that deeper level. And certainly in the role that I have at Flinders, I work a lot with clinicians who volunteer their time to become learning coaches, and that coaching process involves reflective practice and supporting students to maintain a portfolio of evidence that demonstrates their development across all of our course learning outcomes, and helping them to set their own learning goals and then coaching them through that process. And so a project that I am involved in, and we collected data a couple of years ago, and one of our coaches who's a very expert clinician and also an expert coach said that engaging in the process of being a coach actually made him a much better reflective practitioner. He was able to see self-regulated learning in his students, and there was this parallel development. And I think that's really powerful. And that certainly speaks to this idea of informal faculty development, that it's those conversations that you're having with your students over time. It's the conversations you're having with your colleagues who are also coaches, and building that skill set, those expertise, and then really deepening that understanding and that engagement with the process. And I think that is the most powerful informal faculty development that can happen. And to be able to get that data and to be able to read that just fills me with joy, because it's kind of the perfect parallel development between student and coach and clinician coach as well. I'll climb down off my soapbox now.
Thank you.
We should ask our educators to keep those portfolios themselves, right? Because that is obviously, I think that's what my reflection is, and kind of what we are preaching, we will also practice. Being really deliberate in curating those reflections is something I think valuable for all of us.
Would you like to take one more question before moving to the next phase of your presentation?
Yes, I think we will.
Okay, we've got a hand up. Can you unmute yourself, please? I'm not certain how to say your name, if you wouldn't mind saying it for me.
Yes, I know my name is very difficult to pronounce. I'm Kadambari. I'm from India. I'm from a small town in the southern part of India, Pondicherry. I work as a surgeon, a professor of surgery in the medical school that I work in. And I've been associated with faculty development in medical education for almost 15 years now. We run these regular teacher training programs for national level teachers. We are currently designing a project. One of the items that you have mentioned in your article is using evidence in educational practice. And so I'd like to know a little bit more, because we are designing a project to see to what extent teachers in India use evidence, medical teachers use evidence in their day-to-day practice. So I would be interested to know what was the level of employment of evidence that you found in your study among Australian teachers.
Thank you, Kadambari. Kashila or Svetlana, who'd like to respond?
I can go. Thank you, Kadambari, for your question, and we will cover it in the next slide. But I think we can say it now and maybe not need to spend so much time. So what we saw in our study, obviously, that the idea of utilizing evidence in one's practice came up as one of the key affordances, right? But what we also saw in there was that using evidence in practice is a collaborative or social activity. So you do that in partnership with people who know the evidence, because some of the limitations that we saw was that there are conflicting or contrasting sources of evidence. There's conflicting things that are being said in the educational literature. So clinicians need to be engaging in understanding the diversity of the evidence. The other thing is the evidence is dispersed across a number of sources. So it's around in journals, it's in places that are not intuitively familiar to the clinician. So the evidence is diverse, it's dispersed, and it takes different forms. So those were the constraints. We can think of the constraints as the limiting factors. And then there are people think about evidence. So of course, as a surgeon, as a clinician, evidence-based medicine is something that's obviously very dear to your clinical identity. But yet when it comes to the educational evidence and clinicians engaging with that, there was a range of what we call personal kind of capabilities. So mostly people were driven by a curiosity around their teaching. Why am I doing things this way? What does the evidence actually say about this? Are there different ways in which I can frame my practice? People were interested in what was happening beyond their discipline or beyond their specialty. So those were the capabilities. So those were what we call the effectivities, the things that are more inherent to the person that tend to drive our learning. But also on the flip side, there was a varying level of familiarity with the literature and a confidence in seeking out partners, other people who are much more familiar with the evidence. So once again, we came back to this idea that using evidence in practice, it's not a thing that is done. It's not just an interaction between the individual and the evidence. It's actually a social practice where you engage with evidence in collaboration with others. So that's the point. This idea of a social practice keep coming up, that it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's actually quite a complex relationship.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Kashila.
Thank you.
I think you've done a fair bit of the introduction of where you're going next. Would you like to continue?
I have, and I'm going to skip one of the slides because I'm just looking at the time as well. And so what we'll do is, let me go to the next one. So in this slide, we've just done quite a small diagram that kind of situates the theory and the key aspects of it. So affordances and constraints are essentially things to do with the environment, the context in which we're situated, and effectivities are the person-centered elements that I've talked about. So, self-efficacy, confidence, the curiosity, the curious mind, the motivations to engage in faculty development and learning. And I guess the key thing here is to really come back to this idea that what we've done in the paper is to step beyond looking just at the individual. So the individual, and what we've tried to do is to actually look at the context in which this is happening. So I'll go on to this slide, which I think sets things out very clearly, which is, what are the affordances we found? So again, as Megan has said, we've found 3 affordances, which is about utilizing evidence, evaluating our practice, and sharing our educational practice. And you can see in the brackets within all of those that the idea of collaboration and this idea of the social dimension of faculty development keeps coming back out all the time. So it's always in partnership with, in collaboration with, in communities of trusted colleagues. So I see again this Faculty Development Journal Club as a classic example of the spaces in which we learn. So yes, we're presenting, but we're also learning. And in the constraints column, you can see that for each of those affordances, there are a number of elements that tend to drive action and limit our action. So we've talked about educational evidence, but when we think about evaluating our practice, we know what are the quality indicators for teaching. I'm sure this is something asked in all our institutions. What are the quality indicators for education and the metrics around that? We have very narrow and rigid evaluation frameworks and tools. That's something that plagues everyone, I think. We have multiple sources of feedback, and we have very poor guidance and lack of structures for giving feedback, evaluating our practice, but also incorporating that evidence back into our practice. And then in terms of sharing educational practice, what we found were the constraints were there's very limited opportunities to share our practice, because really we work in quite an individualistic educational culture where the things that are rewarded and recognized tend to be more focused on the individual, and we haven't quite worked out how to reward the collaborative element, the social element of faculty development. And also in sharing practice, there's also been a poor visibility. So there's poor visibility of people and their expertise. And once again, I won't go through the effectivities in too much details, but you can see that there's a number of things that people bring with them to that learning experience. There's a desire to learn from others. There's a desire to have these really important conversations about teaching and learning. There's curiosity about the impact of teaching. There's a desire to engage with doing, giving and taking on feedback in different ways. There's an interest in reflection and in asking critical questions about one's own practice, but there's also varying levels of confidence and access to other people and networks. So essentially this slide summarizes the key elements of our paper and the key things that we have found. And I think what we're going to do now is to put you into groups so that you can take a moment in a small group to have a small focused conversation with colleagues. But I'm going to hand over to Svetlana, who will take you through just to orient you to what's expected. So go on to the next slide, Svetlana.
Thanks, Kashila. So as Kashila mentioned, we've got a small group discussion activity for you now, and we have 3 questions that we'd like you to consider. And you'll see that Megan has added a link to the chat to a Padlet, and you'll find the 3 questions there. But essentially, the 3 questions relate to how your workplace, or if we're using situated cognition theory terminology, how does your workplace or the environment afford or constrain informal faculty development? How can faculty development support educators to be adaptable and agile in an ever-changing environment? And I guess this is really prompted by what we're all continuing to talk about, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and how informal faculty development can help us continue to evolve and adapt in that ever-changing environment. And then finally, how can institutions create spaces and places for informal faculty development to occur? So as I mentioned, we've got a Padlet where we would like the small groups to make some notes. So please nominate in your groups someone to scribe as well as someone to report back. And also please take a few moments to introduce yourselves in the group as well. And we'll give you about 15 minutes for this activity. So you might sort of aim for a few minutes per question to discuss and to document in the Padlet. So Megan's going to put you into breakout groups shortly. Thanks, Megan.
All right, hopefully all the rooms are open. There we go. Thank you for coming back to the main room with us after your conversations. We have just a few minutes before we close. Are there any comments from Kushila's group? I won't ask Kushila to report back, but perhaps she'll share the Padlet, or Svetlana will. And someone from Kushila's group can highlight for us one or two aha things perhaps that they heard, and then we'll jump to Svetlana's group just to hear one or two aha moments, because we really do want to end in about 3 or 4 minutes so that you have time to transition to your next appointment or meeting. We don't want anyone to feel they have to rush away. So I will stand here very quietly because I have a teaching background, and I will wait till a member of Kushila group unmutes themselves and speaks.
It looks like it might have to be me. Oh, Manjula, please go ahead.
Speak, yes. So
You didn't wait long enough.
A chance, but since nobody unmuted. So we actually didn't get into the questions posed because we kind of wanted to discuss what was sort of in the front of our minds. So we took the opportunity to talk about what does this mean, situated cognition, and therefore it's a theory. And so one of the members said, I'm used to phenomenology, but I don't understand this. And so it was really good for Kushila to help us understand that theory is different from method. So one is a method and the other is a theory. And then I asked the question around, because there are so many theories out there, how do you know which theory to apply to the study that you want to do or the project that you want to do? And again, she explained really very eloquently, which I have tried in the past to try and apply a theory, because usually what happens is that once the information is gathered, that's when we are searching for a theory, because I'm more used to quantitative research as opposed to qualitative research. And so it was a reversal of thinking, and that's what I thought we were supposed to do. But then Kushila pointed out that, really it's quite similar, that you can go to the theory first as you are envisioning what you want to do. And so start from the beginning rather than the other way around with gathering the information and then going backwards, which is what I've done in the past. So I certainly learned something today.
Thank you very much, Manjula. Is there any other comment or thought from that group? Otherwise, we're going to put Svetlana's group members on the spot to share an insight or an observation from their conversation. And once again, I'm going to challenge Kashila and Svetlana to wait. Please just open your microphone and speak.
Hi, Megan.
Vanessa.
I'm happy to, hello, just do a quick report back. So we were so busy talking that we didn't get time to put our thoughts down in the Padlet, but I did make a few notes. And for the first question, we talked quite a bit about the role of so trainees and trainers, so particularly in that sort of face-to-face clinical environment with the trainer and the trainee, and the role that policy and regulations kind of govern some of those interactions in the context. We talked quite a bit about that. And for the second question, we didn't quite get to the third question, but we had some really good conversation around things that the question was, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but we talked a lot about communication being an enabler to, I think it was around, increasing flexibility and agility. And we talked a bit about bringing, now that we can have some more face-to-face interactions, that sharing and experiencing that dialogue and that communication, understanding the support mechanisms, that peer-to-peer learning that is so valuable that comes from discussing situations and also, I guess, different cases that people have come across. And that either is really helpful in confirming some of the ways that we do things, but also helping us learn new ways of doing things and managing, that on-the-go face-to-face learning that happens in that very complex clinical environment. And then we talked a little bit about trainees being different and their level of agency having risen in the workplace when they're doing that face-to-face learning as well. And how do we make the most of the learner and the learner's agency and what the learner brings to the environment? Because we're all learners in the environment, right? So we just had some conversations about that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So that's just a little taste and a flavor of the conversations in each group. You'll notice in the chat, I've dropped some questions for further thinking that ambitiously Svetlana and Kashila thought we would have time to discuss. But I'm certain if you do want to continue this discussion, they would very much welcome you to contact them. And they're pretty easy to find, given that you've got a link to their article in the chat. I also want to do a brief commercial message that I've dropped in the chat that AMEE 2023 is taking place in person in Glasgow. There will be a hybrid option for those of us located in Australasia, because if your university is like mine, there won't be enough money to fly us to Glasgow next year. So I will definitely be online and having a fantastic opportunity there with you. The recording of this meeting will be available to if you're a member or non-member. So please feel free to have a look at it again. There were some great ideas. And if you could just show the final slide, you don't have to unmute yourself, but please put your hands together to thank our two guest authors, Kashila Kumar and Svetlana King. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for your engagement today and the conversations that you've had. As a member of the AMEE Faculty Development Committee, it's a real honor and privilege to present this journal club in our hemisphere and almost in our time zones for a change. So thank you all very much for being with us today. And kia ora.
And thank you, Megan.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you
been
so
lovely.
much.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Bye.